I'm so happy to be here today. This is just great. It's only just a tiny bit intimidating with all of those callers. I'm just saying. It's a different view up here. So thank you so much for having me. This is great. In 2015, I was invited to attend a meeting where the faith needs in the people of Sioux Falls, South Dakota were being discussed. Now, this was primarily a group of pastors and people that were providing services in the city, my friend Carolyn and myself. Now, many ideas were talked about, many interesting, wonderful, beautiful ideas were discussed. And the one that really piqued my interest was how could we possibly bring faith, or really show it a little more, to people who were unhoused and people who were struggling with poverty. But more importantly, how could we provide a church of word and sacrament on the streets? So several months later, we were attending these meetings and gathering monthly, and I brought my 17-year-old with. After about an hour of talking about it, she was so annoyed and said, "People, you are overthinking this. This is not rocket science. Just take church to the streets." So out of the mouth of babes, we were, yes, this makes a lot of sense. So we asked if we could research this street church thing. We didn't even know if it was called street church. And we did what all people do when they need to research something, and we Googled street church. Now, I'm hoping that my Old Testament professor is not watching this right now. While we were searching, we found Ecclesia Ministries. And Ecclesia Ministries is a group of people that do street church throughout the United States. And they had a gathering coming up in a very short amount of time. So we went back to this group and we asked, can we go and see what this is all about? So the Synod, the South Dakota Synod, says, we'll pay half. And my home church of Peace Lutheran said, we'll pay the other half. My friend Carolyn and I got on a plane, flew to Dallas, Texas, and met with 20 other people who were doing street church. They took us down to Tent City. Now, you do all remember I'm from South Dakota, right? We don't see a lot of tent cities. So they took us to Tent City, and they taught us how to do street ministry. And then at the end of the week, they invited us to participate in their outdoor street church. It was truly amazing. We came back to South Dakota so sure that we could do this thing. We were confident that everybody was going to agree with us, too. No, not necessarily. It didn't really go that way. We wrote down all of our ideas. We wrote down our dreams and our plans and all these things that we had learned. And then we prayed about it. And we prayed a lot. We went back to this group and we said, please pray about this. A little while later, we met with the director of Evangelical Missions, Bill Tesh, and my pastor, Pastor Paul. And we said, we kind of think we're ready to get started on this. So they said, okay, well, what should we do? And we talked about the steps. And so the next meeting, I came with this piece of paper. On this piece of paper were all the qualifications of the person that needed to do this job. They needed to be able to sit with someone on the street in pure silence and listen with grace. But they also needed to be able to go around to all the churches and tell about this ministry. So I'm sure there was this person out there, and I was really excited, and the whole room started laughing and said, did you really not know it was you? I did not. So a couple of weeks later, I quit my job, and I said, all right, God, I know you have a plan, and you've got this, as if you didn't have it already, right? And that's how I became a mission developer with the ELCA. Thankfully, there was mission developer training a few weeks later, so again, I got on a plane and went there, and right away, I was connected with the Homeless and Justice Network of the ELCA. Other people in the ELCA that are doing this same work. That has been a beautiful, beautiful blessing. So we spent the next 6 months going out and surveying the community, asking questions. walking the streets, visiting shelters, going to parks, going underneath bridges where people were sleeping, and going to places where meals were being served. And we asked simple questions. We listened to stories. We built relationships. We prayed with people. We shared Holy Communion out of our backpack. And we said, if you had a church, what would it look like? Seems like a pretty simple question, right? If you had a church, what would it look like? So we took a little bit of time because it was strange for people. They weren't sure if we really wanted to hear the answers to that question. So it took a while. We were consistent. We showed up every single day. We showed people that we cared. We were not going to judge them based on their answer, and we were going to love them as Jesus did. After a while, we started to get some actual answers to these questions that we were asking. And people said they wanted to gather in a place where they didn't have to think about their situation for just that moment. They wanted to pray for people that they had lost and were forgotten. They wanted visits with people that cared about them. They wanted pastoral care. They wanted a church where people understood their lives and knew what was going on. So we took all this information, and that church looked a little different than this church. So we gathered up that information, and we said, okay, we know that in the standard church that there's a little bit of an 80-20 rule happening. So 80% of our energy and effort is spent on worship, and 20% of our energy and effort is spent on mission and outreach. So with these answers that we got, we just flipped that around because we were creating a church for them, right? With them, that they wanted, not what we thought they should have. And so we spend 80% of our effort during the week doing church out of our backpack, meeting people where they are at. And we spend 20% of our energy planning for a monthly worship. A few months later, we were pretty sure we were ready to have that worship. It was a little scary. We had no idea what was going to happen. We had no idea if anybody was going to show up. But we hoped that maybe, 10, 12 people would come. That day, we served Holy Communion to 80 people. It was amazing. It was different again, different than right now and right here. We had people who came to the curb. I kid you not, it was at a curb, and dropped as if it was an altar and cried because they had not been invited to the table in a long time. We had people come through that communion line that talked and hugged and just were having conversations. It wasn't like the communion line that you might have. But guess what? It did not matter. We had people that shouted questions during the sermon. One of them was, "Where's my God?" Poor Pastor Paul, I thought he was going to die. He did great, though. He did great. But again, it just didn't matter. We had people, maybe me, cry during the prayer. But again, it did not matter. We started, and that day began, a worship that happens once a month. And this month, we celebrated 1 full year of active word and sacrament on the streets. We have had many amazing, powerful moments, but I'm told I can't share them all. So, I have it down to just a couple. But one of them is the story of Bobby. Now, we met Bobby when she was 7 months pregnant. Bobby is this wonderful woman that was living in a situation that happened. It just happened. And we were meeting with her, and we were talking, and she was living in a shelter, and a couple months later, which would just be recently, she had a daughter named Baby Juliet. And we call her Baby Juliet because that's what she calls her, Baby Juliet. And she was discharged from the hospital late that night because the doctor discharged her late. Sometimes that happens, right? You would go home to your home. Well, unfortunately, the shelter was closed for the night. So baby Juliet spent her second night of life in a park under her mother's shirt, wrapped up to keep her warm. It was 45 degrees. Now we went and visited her the next day at the shelter, and she said right away, "Would you baptize Juliet?" Yes, of course the answer is yes. We would love to do that. And she said that night in the park, that is what she thought about. Never before in her life, but now she has a connection with the church, and that is what she thought about. So yes, absolutely, we were so excited. The next day, however, I had to go back to the shelter because I forgot to ask about the other 2 children. Have they been baptized? Well, no, they haven't. So now we're up to 3 baptisms that coming weekend. So that weekend at worship, we always have a church partner with us, and we had a great one. We had 2 pastors that were actively serving that church. We had a retired pastor, and we had all of their spouses. So everyone was really covered and being talked to, and it was a wonderful service. A couple of minutes into starting the service, I had one of the spouses actually come up to me and say, "I'd like to introduce you to Tammy." Tammy went to a church as a child that did not baptize infants, and as an adult, she's never been able to get through one of the classes to be baptized, but she desperately wants to be baptized. So again, the answer is yes. We would love to baptize you, Tammy. So we know that Church on the Street is filling a need in the community. It is fulfilling the Great Commission. There is no greater need. And we are out there doing this thing on the streets. We know as God is present there, God is with us. It just happens to be on the streets. It just looks a little different than this place. So this world is a little messy, right? We can all agree the world is a little messy. And our lives are a little messy too. And there are people that may not ever enter the walls of this church. That's okay. I know that's scary for me to say, but that's okay. We are practicing belonging before believing. We are baby-stepping people into church so that someday they may enter the walls of this church, or they may enter the walls of your church. That is our hope and dream. Our church does not care if you have showered. We do not care if you know what the word intinction is. I cannot tell you how many times I've had to explain that. No matter what, you are welcome in this church. In our little church, but in this church, you are welcome. If you believe in Jesus Christ, the gift of grace is for you. We say that every single month. People desperately need to hear that. I'd like to share one more story with you before they drag me off. A few weeks ago, I was driving down the road, and I saw one of our people on the street. Now, back up several months, about 8 months ago, I had met this person literally on the street, but the story was kind of funny. She was walking down the alley with her 16-year-old daughter, and I was walking down the street, and we physically ran into each other. If God was not at work at that moment. I mean, really. So we had to strike up this conversation, and she tells me that this was her first day of homelessness. This day. She had had enough of the abuse. Her and her daughter walked out with the backpack on her back, and that was it. That's all she had. And she simply had a question of, do you know if there's some place to eat? Well, as a matter of fact, I do. Let me walk you there. So as we walked, I learned the story of their lives. I invited them to church on the street. They have been actively coming to that worship now for 8 months. And every single week, we get together and have pastoral care. Every single week. She has been in an apartment for 4 months now. That's pretty important. So back to the story. So I'm driving down the side of the road, and I see her, and it's kind of the wrong side of town, so I know something's not quite right. So I pull over, and I walk to her, and she's happy to see me, but it's really obvious that she's been crying. She tells me that she's on her way to the parole office. Now, she has gone to this parole office for 11 straight months, and everything has really been fine. But she tells me that today is going to be different. She will not pass the urine test. So she's a little upset. I say, I saw you 2 days ago. When did this happen? I couldn't even understand when it happened, and she said it was the night before worship. Okay, so she went on to explain the story, and she tells me, she was at a place she shouldn't have gone, and she was with some people she shouldn't have been with. Those are her words, not mine. And she woke up that morning, and she knew she needed to get to worship. She knew that she needed to get back to her apartment because a van for Church on the Street was going to be picking her up. And she knew that she needed to get to church. She couldn't put her finger on it. She wasn't really sure what exactly it was, but we know that she needed to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. She needed to hear that she was forgiven by His authority. Now, she didn't take communion that day. She told me that she was ashamed and not worthy. She was with someone new that day, so I didn't think much of it. It just is one of these things that happens in street church. So I'm pretty new to this pastor thing, right? Yeah. Okay, I don't even have the title pastor. I am a pastor in training. That is my title. Or in South Dakota, a synodically authorized minister. So I know that she's thinking she's not good enough, right? She is not loved enough. She is not welcome enough. And I know that this is a big moment. Now, I remember that in my van is my backpack. And I remember that it doesn't matter where she lives. It doesn't matter if she lives in a big fancy house, if she lives in a broken down car, or if she lives on the street. It does not matter. So I run back to my van. I grab my backpack, and I run back to her. And there, I kind of need y'all to envision this just a tidge, okay? Really, really, really busy street corner. Honking happening everywhere. People are stopped at this, at the stoplights, and there's a lot happening. And she's sitting on a bus bench. So in that moment, I kneel down and I read to her the words of Holy Communion, the words of institution. We shared that meal in that moment on that bus bench of wine and bread. We both cried. I know you're not surprised by that now. She was crying because she was reminded that this gift was indeed for her. And me, I was reminded that Church on the Street provides a sense of connection, a sense of humanity. It is there in that moment that we are with the neighbor. Not for us, but through Jesus Christ. We meet people where they are at. We are a church without walls, but we're still a church. So I ask you today, if you had a church, what would it look like? Thank you.